If you are planning to come in on that, I'm sorry. Click in that one. All right. All right, and so we'll get into things. Where we left off last time, we are in Acts 21. Paul has kind of completed that third missionary journey, if you will. He's come down to Jerusalem. He's been wanting to be down there. And he met with the elders when he was in Jerusalem. And they gave him some advice. They said, kind of people know that you're coming to the area, and there's a big to-do about it. And so they gave him advice. And so why don't we go ahead, let's turn over to Acts chapter 21. We're gonna backtrack a little bit to verse 23. I know last time we got to verse 25 or 26, but let's pick it up here in Acts chapter 21, verse 23. 23. Acts 21, verse 23 here is on the tail end. He's told, this is James and the other elders, it referenced in verse 18, but they tell him in verse 23, they say, therefore, do what we tell you. We have 4 men who have taken a vow. Take them and be purified with them, and pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that those things of which they were informed concerning you are nothing, but that you yourselves also walk orderly and keep the law. So this speaks to the understanding that James and the elders had. They knew that there were rumors circulating about Paul. They knew what the accusations were, and so they're trying to preemptively address those so that nobody would have something to say concerning Paul. Verse 25, but concerning the Gentiles who believe, we have written and decided that they should observe no such thing, except that they should keep themselves from things offered to idols, from blood, from things strangled, and from sexual immorality. And this is something we covered the last time. I'm not gonna revisit that per se, but it just shows that they were not looking to change doctrine at all. And I alluded to this last time. I added a little bit more research into it this time, but the vow that we're talking about there in verse 23, it is generally accepted that they're talking about a Nazirite vow. But what is a Nazirite vow? If you wanted to, as a reference, you can go back and you can go to Judges chapter 13. You'll see there's also the Samuel, I believe, had a Nazirite vow. There was also the situation with Samson's mother, and just different individuals who have taken them. Now, it's supposed that also in Acts 18, verse 18, we reference where Paul, Ananias, and Sapphira were going and they were traveling, that it was likely a Nazirite vow because it references the cutting of the hair. But a little bit of information here about the Nazirite vow. This is from Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown. Going back to, if you wanted a little bit more about the Nazirite vow, just jot down in your notes, Numbers chapter 6, verses 1 through 8 and 13 through 22, kind of cover the Nazirite vow in a little bit more detail. But here's the commentary on Numbers chapter 6 from Jameson, Fawcett, and Brown. It says, when either man or woman shall vow a vow of the Nazirite, it's talking about being separated. They're separated ones, they're set apart. It comes from the Hebrew word to separate. And it was used to designate a class of persons who, under the impulse of extraordinary piety and with a view to higher degrees of religious improvement, voluntarily renounce the occupations and pleasures of the world to dedicate themselves unreservedly to the divine service. So you think about how Samuel's mother, how Hannah gave him to a lifetime of service to God. But it's an individual who sets themselves apart for the sake of a more dedicated, a more focused, a voluntary service to God. One could think, not the best parallel, but one could think of monks and as well as nuns, individuals who will sequester themselves off for the sake of a more pious, in that view, lifestyle of dedication to God. Couple other references. Now, this is not a direct, this is not a, I won't say that this is slight speculation here, but the the issue of Jephthah and his oath and what his daughter did. As to whether that was a human sacrifice or not, I might be opening a can of worms here, but she went off and she bemoaned her virginity, and then some would say that it wasn't a human sacrifice, but it was a sacrifice like this, where it went into a vow of a life of piety and service to God, as opposed to a life of pursuing her own pleasures. Paul also references this a little bit, where it's better for some of you, like it is for me, just remain unmarried in service and focus to God. Jameson Fawcett Brown goes on and says, these individuals who were voluntarily renouncing their occupations and pleasures of the world to dedicate themselves unreservedly to divine service, they separated themselves from three things in particular, namely from wine and all the varieties of vinous produce, from the application of a razor to their head, allowing their hair to grow, and from pollution by a dead body. And it's interesting when you consider those three things, from wine to their hair to the body. James Fawcett Brown goes on to say the reasons of the self-restriction are obvious. The use of wine tended to inflame the passions, intoxicate the brain, and create a taste for luxurious indulgence. The cutting of the hair being a recognized sign of uncleanness, referencing Leviticus 4, verses 8 and 9. This is, moreover, contact with a dead body, disqualifying for the divine service. The Nazarite carefully avoided such a cause of unfitness, and like the high priest, did not assist at the funeral rites of his nearest relatives, referring his duty to God, to the indulgence of his strongest natural affections. If you wanted to jot down in your notes, Matthew 18, verse 18 through 22, when Jesus Christ is going, he calls somebody, he says, follow me, and he says, well, can I first go and bury my family? He says, let the dead bury the dead. When we're committed to God, there are things that sometimes we forego. And one of the things that was a component of the Nazarite vow was that you don't touch the dead body. You're not there preparing it. And much in the same way of Jesus Christ's comments, let the dead bury the dead. Jameson Fawcett Brown goes on and says, when the days of his separation are fulfilled, on the accomplishment of a limited vow of Nazaritism. So obviously, if you're taking a lifelong Nazarite vow, like it is believed that Samuel had, then there wouldn't be a completion of it. The conclusion would be at your death. But if you're doing a limited vow, then the Nazarite might cut their hair wherever they happen to be. Again, reference Acts 18, verse 18, where Paul, with Ananias and Sapphira, cut their hair prior to a travel. A side resource to this, Wikipedia referenced that if a Jew, someone who had taken a Nazarite vow, was in Jerusalem, hair was cut in the outer courtyard of the temple complex. So, and this is because, as Jameson Fawcett Brown goes on and says, but the hair was to be carefully kept and brought to the door of the sanctuary in Jerusalem. Then after the presentation of sin offerings and burnt offerings, it was put under the vessel in which the peace offerings were boiled, and the priest taking the shoulder, then boiled shoulder when boiled in a cake and wafer of the meat offering, put them in the hands of the Nazarite to wave before the Lord as a token of thanksgiving, and thus released from their vow. So the hair became a part of the purification process that had to be saved, and almost as a verification that the vow had been kept, right? So if you're not cutting your hair for a month or a year or whatever, however long it is, if your hair grows 3 to 4 inches a year, whatever that length is, it was kind of proof that the vow had been maintained for the entirety of the time. So you brought that hair with you to the temple. But if you were in Jerusalem, in the temple complex, in Jerusalem, then you would get your hair cut at the temple complex, which brings us back to that the situation with Paul, and he was told to take the 4 men from verse 23 to be purified with them, pay their expenses so that they may shave their heads, and that all may know that you're still upholding the vows, the rites, the traditions of the of the Jews, right? Because the things that they were teaching, they were talking about to the Gentiles. They weren't telling the Jews not to be circumcised. They weren't telling the Jews those things. It was what they were teaching to the Gentiles. Again, Acts 18:18, either Paul or Aquila had themselves taken a vow. Going down, those are some of the things we covered last time. Verse 26 and 27 here. It says, Then Paul took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification, at which time an offering should be made for each one of them. Now when the 7 days were almost ended, the Jews from Asia, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. And again here, there's supposition, it's speculation as to why Paul would have had to go through this unless he himself was doing another vow. But just whether it was because he was out of the country, just coming into Jerusalem, or if it was just there were also purification processes that the Jews have implemented in the temple, just for the sake of elevating the level of purity when you come in. You consider the number of rules for how to observe the Sabbath. There are all these things that they had put into place. But so it's not 100% clear as to why Paul did this, other than going over the top to show, yes, I'm participating in this. Your accusations have no grounds here. But there is some historical precedent for this. If you go, turn back to Leviticus chapter 14, verse 8. If you keep your spot here in Acts, Leviticus chapter 14 and verse 8. Leviticus 14, verse 8 here. This is speaking this is in relation to the lepers. And in verse 8 it says, He who is to be cleansed shall wash his clothes, shave off all his hair, and wash himself in water, that he may be clean. After that he shall come into the camp, shall stay outside his tent 7 days. So he didn't stay where he was normally staying. And so it could possibly be that upon the shaving of the hair and the purification, it had to stay in the temple area. There were many rooms that could have been fit for that, but if he wasn't supposed to go back to his home because the purification process was there, to stay outside of his own tent, he came into the camp but stayed outside of his own tent for 7 days. But verse 9, but on the seventh day he shall shave all the hair off his head and his beard and his eyebrows, all his hair he shall shave off. He shall wash his clothes and wash his body in water, and he shall be clean. So that's Leviticus 14, verses 8 and 9, dealing with lepers. We see a similar thing in the next chapter in Leviticus 15, verse 13. Leviticus 15, verse 13. This is just speaking of other individuals who were unclean due to bodily discharges or anything of that nature. It says, when he who has a discharge is cleansed of his discharge, then he shall count for himself 7 days for his cleansing, wash his clothes, and bathe his body in running water, then he shall be clean. And then on the 8th day there are the various animals for sacrifice. On the 8th day he shall take for himself 2 turtle doves or 2 pigeons, and come before the Lord to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and give them to the priest. The priest shall offer them as one as a sin offering, and the other as a burnt offering. So the priest shall make atonement for him before the Lord because of his discharge. So this is talking about uncleanness. Now it doesn't specifically talk to whatever vows, because we don't know exactly the vows that Paul or the 4 men had taken, but we do see at least a precedent being set for the 7 days for purification, for the shaving of the hair and that sort of thing. So this would have been something that's occurring over at the temple complex. Another reference here, this is from Wikipedia referencing these things. It says, both traditional, religious, and secular scholars agree that ritual washing in Judaism was derived by the rabbis of the Talmud from a more extensive set of ritual washings and purity practices in use in the days of the temple in Jerusalem. Based on various verses in the Hebrew scriptures and received traditions, so that's what it was based on. There is disagreement, however, about the origins and meanings of these practices. So we do see some of that here in Leviticus that we just read. We saw some of that referenced in Numbers when we're talking about the Nazirite vows. The Jewish Virtual Library then speaks a little bit more about this as far as the purification, the washings, referred to as ablution. It was an immersion process. There were actually different kinds of ablution. So they had some where it was a pouring, there was just the hands and feet, and then there was the whole body. So there were different kinds of different, I guess, stages of ablution. But this is referring to, in this section with Paul and the vows, they're talking about a full immersion. And Jewish Virtual Library says this. It says, the act of washing performed to correct a condition of ritual impurity and restore the impure to a state of ritual purity. The ritually impure or unclean person is prohibited from performing certain functions and pertaining in certain rites. Ablution, following a withdrawal period, and in some cases other special rituals, renders him again clean and permitted to perform those acts which his impurity had prevented. Sound a little bit like baptism, so, and this is where Paul wasn't decrying it. He's saying you can go ahead and do these rituals, but again, we understand that as Christ said, there's no washing that is going to make you clean. We have to be washed by his blood. So these ritual purification processes would happen in and around the temple. Let me go ahead and pull up I'll share that temple picture again. But this temple complex, as you can see there, if you look up towards the upper right-hand corner of the picture, you'll see there's a pool of Israel. They had that for washing potentially sacrificial animals. But along the south side, and I'm trying to see here if I can, the south side, which would have been where you see all of the steps on the lower left-hand side over there, where the double gate is, the monumental, that big stairway, the royal stoa, which is where Herod had built that massively long portico. Along that area, that's where the majority of mikvahs, or ritual baths, are found in the temple complex area. There are over 100 that have been found that are over there, and the majority of them are along the southern wall of the Temple Mount. They were supposed to be, they were used as ritual washing for purifications in order to be able to enter into more restricted areas of the temple. So you had to be able to be purified or cleansed in those mikvahs. They were supposed to be filled with living water. So that meant it could either be from a spring, it could be from rain or a cistern, but you couldn't just haul water from a well and put it in there. It had to be what they classified as living water. You couldn't just fill a pool. They were supposed to hold 40 seahs of water, which is approximately 77, a little bit more than 77 gallons of water, so about a bathtub full. But they were supposed to hold that because you were supposed to be able to, depending on the type of purification, be able to do a full immersion of an average human being. And so this is the ritual process of cleansing that was going on. And so that happens. And then you have, in addition to this, not just the washing, but then you have, if you go back to Acts chapter 21, we're here now, we're in the temple. Verse 26, Paul and the men, he took the men, and the next day, having been purified with them, he entered the temple to announce the expiration of the days of purification. So at which time an offering should be made. And these offerings, as we read, you could be the turtle doves, it could be the pigeons, there are various other offerings, again, dependent upon the vow and what was happening. But they would have come into the temple complex area. And the Jews from Asia, verse 27, seeing him in the temple, stirred up the whole crowd and laid hands on him. So we see these Jews from Asia. That's where Paul had just come from. Ephesus was kind of the hub of Asia, and that's where he worked from to preach the gospel at that time. And in all likelihood, it's the same Jews who essentially besieged him when he was there in Ephesus, and the ones who worked everybody up to a furor to where he had to move to the school of Tyrannus, and he couldn't teach in the It's not a temple over there, but he couldn't teach over there anymore. And so it's likely that they're the same ones, and we can draw that conclusion because in verse 28 they stirred up the whole crowd, crying, "Men of Israel, help! This is a man who teaches all men everywhere against the people, the law, and this place. And furthermore, he also brought Greeks into the temple and has defiled this holy place." For they had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, with him in the city, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. So they recognized an Ephesian. So again, it's likely that they're from Ephesus, that they came down, and one could say that if nothing else, they are persistent, these Jews who are stirring things up. And we'll see here in verse 28 that they level 4 different accusations against Paul. So they level 4 accusations against him, and they say he's teaching against the people. Now, that people that they're referring to are the Jews. He's teaching against the people because the argument here is regarding what he's teaching the Jews and the Gentiles, and to go against the law, which was the second accusation. So he's teaching against the people, he's teaching against the law, he's teaching against the temple, and, oh, by the way, number 4, he brought a Gentile into the temple. Now, this brings to the fore a very important accusation that they made, because if you, actually, let me transition back to the temple. We kind of just referenced this the last time, but if you look here in the temple complex, Herod had done a massive amount of, we'll say, upgrades and expansions to the Temple Mount. And if you look here in the center, you have, you can see the section where the Holy of Holies is housed. You see the open area where some of the other acts would occur. And you see around that, actually it's mentioned, the 3rd paragraph up on the right-hand side, the soreg. The soreg. It was a low lattice screen or railing prohibited Gentiles or non-purified Jews from entering the temple courts. This soreg was constructed by Herod, by the Romans. It was somewhere between 2.5 and 4 feet tall, but it was constructed to create a designation for where non-Jews had to stop. So the women could go further in, as you can see, actually in part of the original temple complex area that Solomon had built. There's the court of the women, right? But no Gentile was allowed to go past the soreg. In fact, there's a, let me see if I can, let me pull up that other picture here. Bear with me, I'm going to get the other picture of the, where are we here? This is a picture of one of the stones that has the Greek inscription on it that was giving a warning. It says, "No foreigner shall enter." And these were posted. They have 2 copies at least of these that were posted on this soreg, on this short wall going around the temple. And so, wrong way. And so that was around the perimeter of this section of the original temple complex. And there is an article that was written at Brown University. And I'm going to read, it's kind of a long article, but I think it's very informative. And I just pushed the wrong button. Bear with me. All right. This is regarding that wall and the inscription that was on it. It's an article titled "Keep Out for the Sake of All That Is Holy, a Temple Warning Inscription." This is a 2017 article by Lauren Monteith. And she said, Jerusalem this time regarded images as forms of idolatry, and coins with images had to be exchanged for temple currency. Consider when Jesus Christ was asked whether or not what to do about taxes. And so he took the coin and he said, well, whose face is on that? Well, within the temple complex, they didn't want a coin with a face on it. So what would happen is you'd have to exchange your Roman currency for temple currency. And one of the things that the Israelites were condemned for was their usury practices and what they would exchange rate for people over time and debt and things like that. And it was likely the case here that they did the same sort of thing with not only the temple currency, but also with the animals and the doves that they sold, because you would have to select the animals and that you would have used, and so they could sit there and they could say, well, this one has a blemish or this one doesn't, that one's unacceptable, and all of those sorts of things. Going on here. It says, to satisfy both the interests of the temple's worshippers and those who profited from the temple's secular function, Herod's builders erected strict physical boundaries separating the holy inner sanctum of the temple from the bustling marketplace. A low wall or parabolos demarcated, or soreg, again, depending on the language you're using, demarcated the beginning of the sacred area of the temple. The sacred area included all the temple's older sections built by King Solomon in the 10th century BCE. A series of keep out signs in both Greek and Latin were posted along this wall at regular intervals to warn away those who were non-Jewish and thus unfit to enter the sacred place. Two of these keep out signs have survived to the present day. The most complete of the two, discovered on the Temple Mount in 1871, reads, "No alien may enter within the balustrade around the sanctuary and the enclosure. Whoever is caught, on himself shall he put blame for the death which will ensue." So they were allowed to exact the death penalty for a breach of that. The fact that the signs were, the article goes on, the fact that the signs were written in Greek and Latin, but not Hebrew, the local vernacular, or Aramaic, the regional language, reflected the fact that the signs explicitly targeted foreigners and not people from the immediate vicinity, even those who were non-Jewish. The language of the signs also suggests that they were put up by rulers representing the Roman Empire and Hellenic, i.e. Greek, influence instead of the temple priests. And then it goes on to kind of describe going in beyond this area. I'll jump ahead to, it says, the temple's many subdivisions and restrictions on who could enter each successive area reflected the hierarchical structure of Jewish society at the time. These hierarchies were based on ritual and genealogical purity. The high priest traditionally traced his paternal ancestry to Aaron, brother of Moses, and followed a strict regimen of religious laws. So these are things that were done in place to, in that way, preserve the sanctity of the temple, who could go where, and those sorts of things. And so when the accusation is leveled against Paul that he had brought a Gentile beyond the court of the Gentiles, past the soreg, past those warning signs, into the area where the sacrifices are given, this is a capital offense. And that is why they level that. Now, for the sake of background, let's go ahead, if you will, let's turn to Ephesians chapter 2. Ephesians chapter 2, and we'll read that because this is quite insightful and interesting when you not only consider the audience, who is Paul is talking to in the section of Scripture, but also who is there in Acts 21 and who is leveling these accusations against him. Ephesians chapter 2. And you, this is Paul speaking to those in Ephesus, and you he made alive, who were dead in trespasses and sins, in which you once walked according to the course of this world, according to the prince of the power of the air, the spirit who now works in the sons of disobedience, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of our flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and of the mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. But God, who is rich in mercy, because of his great love which he loved us, even when we were dead in trespasses, made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, and raised us up together, and made us sit together in the heavenly places in Christ Jesus, that in the ages to come he might show the exceeding riches of his grace in his kindness toward us in Christ Jesus. For by grace you have been saved through faith, and that not of yourselves, it is a gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast, for we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. Therefore, remember that you, once Gentiles in the flesh, who are called uncircumcision by what is called the circumcision, made in the flesh by hand, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. But now in Christ Jesus, you who once were far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. But he himself is our peace, who has made both one, and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is, the law of commandments contained in ordinance, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace, and that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who are afar off, and to those who were near. For through him we both have access, by one Spirit, to the Father. Now therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God, having been built on the foundations of the apostles and prophets, Jesus Christ himself being the chief cornerstone, in whom the whole building, being fitted together, grows into a holy temple in the Lord, in whom you also are being built together for a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. Now consider that as a message that he is giving, a concept that he may have given there, a letter to Ephesus. Going back down to verse 14, he leads up to the beginning of chapter 2, talking about the history of the Gentiles, being sinners, being saved through grace, right? And he goes in verses 11 through 13 and says, you were Gentiles in the flesh. You were aliens. You're these people who are on the outside when those of the circumcision consider you. But in verse 14, speaking of Christ, he himself is our peace, who has made both one and has broken down the middle wall of separation. What is that? That is exactly what we were just looking at. This short soreg wall, 2.5 to 4 feet, around the entirety of the more holy section of the temple, is that middle wall of separation. And he's saying Christ broke that down to let you in so that you are no longer the aliens, right? You're no longer that. You're reconciled, made one. So there is no more enmity. Verse 19, therefore you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. You can cross that line. And so if you consider what the people are hearing, and you understand the background of the temple complex, how Herod set that up, and to say so audaciously that middle wall has been broken down, surely he brought Tromethius in there with him. We saw him together. We heard him preach. We know that's what he's saying, right? And so they raise up a bit of a furor. So back over in Acts chapter 21, verse 30. Acts 21, verse 30. Actually, before we do that, just as a couple reference scriptures here, you can jot down Exodus 20, verse 16. The accusations that these Jews from Asia level against Paul are unsubstantiated accusations. We have to be extremely careful with the words that we say. So Exodus chapter 20, verse 16 is the 9th commandment. Do not bear false witness. The penalty for bearing false witness is found in Deuteronomy chapter 19, verses 15 through 21. If you are found to falsely bear witness, then if you're found to falsely bear witness, then you get the penalty that the other person was going to have. Think of Mordecai and Haman. Um, so um, it's kind of a big thing, but there is no recourse for them in this against them in this case. But they just get everybody up in in emotional furor and a fit. But that is not something to be taken lightly, because to bear false witness means you are going against somebody, and the penalty that would have been exacted. It's a big thing. And you think of how different our world would be if the people who were so quick and willing to uh, cast the cast aspersions on the water and undercut somebody else had the penalty conveyed to them. You might think twice about what you say. Um, verse 30. So all the city was disturbed, and the people ran together to seize Paul and drag him out of the temple, and immediately the doors were shut. It's been a while since we read something like this, but the last time we have a record of an angry mob like this is in Acts chapter 7, verse 57 through 58. And I don't think it's an accident that God inspired Acts 7 and the martyrdom and the killing of Stephen to be recorded, and almost Stephen were laid after the mob was angry, stopped at their ears, ran out of the city, threw Stephen out of the city off the parapet and stoned him, right? Um, Now here, Paul is on the receiving end of that. Another similar situation is found in Acts 27, verse 15 through 23, where you see this crowd. They're all in a tizzy. That was Matthew 27, verses 15 through 23. But the people here, still in Acts 21:31, they're seeking to kill Paul. News comes to the commander of the garrison that all Jerusalem is in an uproar. And so he immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down to them. And when they saw the commander and the soldiers, then they stopped beating Paul. And then the commander came near and took him and commanded him to be bound with 2 chains. And he asked who he was and what he had done. And some among the multitude cried one thing, and some another. So when he could not ascertain the truth because of the tumult, he commanded him to be taken into the barracks. When he reached the stairs, he had to be carried, he being Paul, when he reached the stairs, he had to be carried by the soldiers because of the violence of the mob. For the multitude of the people followed after, crying out, "Away with him!" Again, you have the same sort of mob mentality that was present at the time of Jesus' crucifixion. What did they say? That they were crying out. Matthew 27:15 through 23. They cried out for Barabbas. And they said, "Away with Jesus. We don't want him. Crucify him. We want Barabbas." And that's what the leaders had kind of stoked the fires to have them say. Paul was beaten numerous times. He has referenced that in his letters to the churches. This time he wasn't dead. Acts 14, verse 19 through 20. We can turn there. We've read it already in this study some time ago. But Acts chapter 14, we see here he was beaten, stoned, and left for dead. Acts chapter 14, verse 19 says, "And the Jews from Antioch and Iconium," which is technically up in the Galatia area, but it may have been because it's not that far outside of Asia. But anyway, so the Jews from Antioch and Iconium came there, and having persuaded the multitude, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. However, when the disciples gathered around him, he rose up and went into the city, and the next day he departed with Barnabas to Derbe. So Paul is just a lightning rod for these individuals who are seeking him out in that way. And unlike the Jews, where the Jews didn't hear the accusations, so the accusations of the Asian Jews were just taken at face value. They said, "We saw Paul. Pretty sure he brought a Greek in there. Get him. Here's what he's doing." But unlike them, the commander of the garrison is trying to get the truth of the matter. Now he's not able to because of the tumult, but you can refer to Proverbs 25, verse 2. It says it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, but the glory of kings is to search out a matter. Proverbs 18, verse 17. "The first one to plead his cause seems right until his neighbor comes and examines him." And that's what the leader of the garrison was trying to do. But again, did not have the opportunity. Verse 37 through 40 here. As Paul was about to be led into the barracks, he said to the commander, "May I speak to you?" And the commander replied, "Can you speak Greek? Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" But Paul said, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people." So when the commander of the garrison had given him permission, Paul stood on the stairs and motioned with his hand to the people. And when there was a great silence, he spoke to them in the Hebrew language, saying, and he goes on, "Brethren and fathers, hear my defense before you now." What we get here in these last 4 verses of chapter 21, first of all, the commander is surprised that Paul knows Greek. It's not just a question, but you remember going back to Acts 2, when you have the day of Pentecost, what was the crowd's response to these men from Galilee? The people who followed Jesus, they were uneducated people. They were given to these crazy things. They didn't do the same washings. They ate with sinners, all these various other things that they did. But the people, the multitudes, were surprised. How can these Galileans, uneducated guys, be teaching us this? Who are you to say that? And so we have here a kind of a little bit of a surprised reaction from the leader of the garrison. He's like, "Oh, you can speak Greek?" And he says, "Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins out into the wilderness?" There is an account in Josephus, his book Wars of the Jews, volume 2, chapter 13, section 5, or paragraph 5. This actually, you can find it free online. If you'd like, send me an email. I will send you the links. I'm happy to share any of the links from this if you want to be able to read the other articles, so you can have those. Happy to share the notes. But there is not a clear link, but Josephus does reference an Egyptian who was a false prophet, who affected, who brought about a bit of, well, I'll just read what it says here, a bit of mischief. So this is from Josephus' Wars of the Jews, volume 2, chapter 13, section 5. It says, "But there was an Egyptian false prophet that did the Jews more mischief than the former, for he was a cheat, and pretended to be a prophet also, and got together 30,000 men that were deluded by him. These he led round from the wilderness to the mount, which is called the Mount of Olives, and was ready to break into Jerusalem by force from that place. And if he did not but once conquer the Roman garrison, and if he could but once conquer the Roman garrison and the people, he intended to domineer over them by the assistance of those guards of his that were to break into the city with him. But Felix prevented his attempt, and met him with his Roman soldiers, while all the people assisted him in his attack upon them, insomuch that when it came to battle, the Egyptian ran away with a few others, while the greatest part of those that were with him were either destroyed or taken alive. But the rest of the multitude were dispersed, everyone to their own homes, and there concealed themselves." So it kind of also speaks a little bit to what Gamaliel had said when they were talking about whether or not, when the leaders of the Jews were talking about how they should address the way, and the apostles, the disciples who were coming about, and you cut off the head, and the body quickly dies. And so if it's of God, though, who can stop it and who wants to be in the way? And so the garrison commander asks Paul, "Are you this guy?" So there's a possibility that this is the same Egyptian. If, and I say big if, because again, we don't have conclusive evidence here, but if this is the same Egyptian that the commander of the garrison is referring to, then the discrepancy in numbers, because you see here in Acts chapter 21, it says, verse 38, "Are you not the Egyptian who some time ago stirred up a rebellion and led the 4,000 assassins?" Last I checked, 4,000 is not 30,000, right? So maybe potentially that discrepancy is due to how many were armed. So maybe there were fewer who were armed, and so the number was actually 4,000 and not 30,000 who were armed. Or it could be, it says, Josephus's account says that a small number of them escaped into the wilderness with him, escaped with him. So perhaps the small number who escaped um, with him are that 4,000, and they knew that it was 4,000, and the rest of them is what makes up the other 26,000 people who were either captured, killed, or hid in their homes. So there's a possibility that's the case, but again, I'm not staking anything on that. It's just the possibility there. And then another thing that is nested into this, Paul says in verse 39, he says, I am a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no mean city, and I implore you, permit me to speak to the people. Paul here is essentially name dropping. He says, I was born in Tarsus of Cilicia. Hint, hint, I can speak Greek, which is the language of the Roman Empire. I was born in Tarsus in Cilicia, which is, hint, hint, it's a Roman prefecture, that Roman territory there. I'm a Roman citizen. You consider back in, I think it's Acts, was it Acts 14 again? I apologize, I didn't write this down in my notes. When he is beaten in, Philippi, Acts 16. Yeah, Acts 16, verse 35, when they find out, they're told to be let go. Acts chapter 16, verse 35, when it was day, the magistrate sent the officer saying, let those men go. So the keeper of the prison reported these words to Paul, saying, the magistrates have sent to let you go. Now therefore depart and go in peace. And Paul said to them, they have beaten us openly, uncondemned Romans, and have thrown us into prison. And now they put us out secretly? No, indeed. Let them come out themselves and get us out. And so Paul here is kind of name dropping, alluding to it's not a small city. I'm over there. Yeah, I am a Roman citizen. Let me speak to the people. And we see here again the education of Paul, his ability to traverse between groups, and we've seen that whether he's speaking to those in Athens, in Corinth, and just in how he engaged with people, he met them in that way where they were. And was able to, with the exception of the Jews, in many cases, convince, rebuke, exhort, and all of those things that we ought to be able to do when it comes to the Word of God. But so he is given permission. Verse 40, so Paul stands on the stairs, motions with his hands to the people, and begins speaking to them in Hebrew. And so we see here, I'm not going to dive into chapter 22 because that is a whole nother study in itself. I also realized that I forgot to share a couple other pictures here, not pressing pictures, but just of a mikvah, just for your reference here. So a couple pictures here just of ancient mikvahs that can show you kind of the size in some of the ruins. And they have found well over 100 of these just in and around the Temple Mount. Let me make sure I actually show it in transition. There we go. So this is a picture of a mikvah, the ritual bath, and you see they have the stone. And what they would do is they would actually plaster the side so that it would hold the water. But it could, again, either be filled from a stream, if a stream flowed into it, through it, because the goal and desire here was for it to be living water. So a cistern, a stream, or rain, things of that were not stagnant water. It had to be running or be able to be interchanged. They actually have rules about how much, like if the volume of it is supposed to be 40 seahs, as I mentioned, about 77 gallons, and there's a proportion that you are allowed to replace with drawn water. So if you draw water to fill it, you can only do it a certain proportion. I failed to write that down, so I don't have that in front of me. But here's another picture of a different one. But you can look and see that these are all over in Jerusalem. And there are many suppositions about how they were used, who used them, whether they were private, and all sorts of other things concerning the use of them for purification and whatnot based on their location. But it's an interesting in regards to the temple and what Paul was facing there. So with that, I think we'll cut this a little bit short. So if there are any questions, if you wanted to text me, I know we've got a couple minutes here, you can send those to me. I'll check my email here real quick just to see if there's any that came through while I was talking. I apologize if the connection hasn't been the most secure. I know we had a couple with spotty audio or spotty video that went in and out. All right, I don't see any that came in. I don't see any text messages coming through. But again, I'll say that if you'd like any of the references that I'm using, if you just want to copy my notes, I'm happy to send my notes over. Happy to make those available for any of your individual study and things like that, links to the pictures and all the other fun stuff, so you can have those for your reference. If there are any questions you have as we're going into chapter 22, hopefully we'll be able to finish that. But next time we'll see. I seem to be slowing down as we get farther into Acts. So hopefully we'll get through chapter 22 next month. But I think we'll conclude it there. And why don't we conclude with prayer, since it's always a good way to end things off, and God willing, we'll all be able to be together safely tomorrow for the Sabbath. So let's go ahead. Let's